Tech mogul Richard Sterling thought he had the perfect setup in his private executive suite at Sterling Dynamics headquarters. His affair with Secretary Madison Blake had been going on for months, hidden from his wife Catherine through careful planning and corporate power that kept employees silent. "My wife thinks I'm in back-to-back board meetings all afternoon," Richard whispered to Madison as she entered his luxury office for their secret rendezvous. "She has no idea what really goes on in the executive suite." Madison smiled seductively while locking the office door behind her. Poor Catherine. She's so naive about the business world and what successful men really need. Neither of them noticed the slight movement of the security camera that had been remotely activated, or realized that Catherine Sterling was watching everything unfold from the parking garage through her phone. What Richard didn't know was that his wife Catherine held controlling interest in Sterling Dynamics through a complex trust structure, possessed an MBA from Stanford and a law degree from Yale, and had been systematically documenting his infidelity while preparing the most devastating corporate takedown in business history. The cameras were about to capture the shock of his lifetime. If this story resonates with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The Sterling Dynamics headquarters tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a gleaming sword of glass and steel, rising 68 stories above the bustling streets of the financial district. The building represented the physical manifestation of Richard Sterling's technology empire, a monument to innovation and corporate success that housed one of America's fastest-growing software companies, specializing in artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and enterprise security solutions that served Fortune 500 clients worldwide. Richard's private executive suite occupied the entire top floor of the building, featuring panoramic views of Manhattan, Central Park, and the Hudson River that stretched to the horizon. The 10,000-square-foot space had been designed as the ultimate expression of corporate power and personal luxury, with imported Italian marble floors, handcrafted furniture by renowned European artisans, original artwork worth millions of dollars, and technology systems that rivaled government facilities in their sophistication and security capabilities. The executive suite served multiple purposes beyond traditional corporate leadership, functioning as Richard's personal sanctuary, where he could conduct confidential business dealings, entertain high-profile clients and investors, and pursue personal activities that required absolute privacy and discretion. The space included a private conference room with military-grade encryption for sensitive discussions, a fully equipped kitchen and dining area for intimate business meals, a luxury bedroom suite for extended work sessions, and recreational facilities that allowed Richard to host exclusive gatherings for the global elite. At 44 years old, Richard had built Sterling Dynamics from a small startup into a technology powerhouse worth over $15 billion, with offices in major cities worldwide and contracts with government agencies, multinational corporations, and emerging technology companies that relied on his innovative solutions for digital transformation and cybersecurity protection. His public persona as a visionary entrepreneur and philanthropist had earned recognition from business magazines, technology conferences, and charitable organizations that celebrated his contributions to innovation and social responsibility. But beneath the carefully cultivated public image, Richard had developed a pattern of infidelity and deception that had characterized his personal relationships throughout his rise to corporate prominence. His marriage to Catherine Sterling had provided social status and business connections that enhanced his credibility with investors and clients, while his affairs with employees and business associates satisfied personal desires that he felt entitled to pursue without considering the consequences for his wife or the women he manipulated through promises and financial incentives. Madison Blake represented Richard's latest conquest in a series of inappropriate relationships with subordinate employees who were vulnerable to his advances due to their dependence on employment and advancement opportunities within Sterling Dynamics. At 28 years old, Madison worked as Richard's executive secretary, managing his calendar, communications, and travel arrangements, while providing the kind of personal attention and admiration that fed his narcissistic needs for constant validation and sexual gratification. Madison's position provided intimate access to Richard's daily routine, business operations, and personal vulnerabilities that she had learned to exploit for her own advancement within the corporate hierarchy. Her background included a degree in business administration from a respectable state university, previous experience as an administrative assistant at smaller companies, and ambitious career goals that she believed could be achieved through strategic relationships with powerful executives who controlled hiring, promotions, and salary decisions. The affair had begun 6 months earlier, during a company retreat at Richard's private estate in the Hamptons, where alcohol consumption and isolated accommodations had created opportunities for inappropriate interactions between the CEO and his secretary. Richard had used his authority and wealth to gradually break down Madison's professional boundaries, offering career advancement, salary increases, and luxury experiences in exchange for sexual favors and emotional availability that went far beyond appropriate employer-employee relationships. Madison had initially resisted Richard's advances, understanding the professional risks and ethical problems associated with workplace relationships between supervisors and subordinate employees. But Richard's persistent manipulation, combined with his promises of career advancement and financial security, had gradually overcome her resistance while creating psychological dependency that made it difficult for her to refuse his demands or consider the long-term consequences of their inappropriate relationship. The secret meetings in Richard's executive suite had become routine occurrences, carefully scheduled during times when his wife Catherine was occupied with her own activities and when other employees were unlikely to witness their inappropriate behavior. Richard had convinced Madison that their affair was a sophisticated arrangement between consenting adults who understood the mutual benefits of discretion and strategic partnership in advancing both their personal and professional interests. But what neither Richard nor Madison realized was that their affair was taking place under the constant surveillance of advanced security systems that Richard had installed throughout Sterling Dynamics to protect against corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. The high-definition cameras and audio recording equipment that monitored executive areas for business security purposes had been systematically documenting their inappropriate relationship while creating comprehensive evidence of Richard's violation of corporate policies and professional ethics. Catherine Sterling had discovered her husband's infidelity through careful investigation and systematic evidence gathering that reflected her own sophisticated understanding of corporate operations, legal procedures, and financial management that Richard had consistently underestimated throughout their 12-year marriage. Her discovery of the affair had prompted a comprehensive strategy for exposing Richard's behavior while protecting her own interests and ensuring maximum consequences for his betrayal and deception. At 39 years old, Catherine possessed educational credentials and professional experience that would have intimidated even someone as arrogant as Richard Sterling, though he had consistently dismissed her intelligence and capabilities, while assuming that her role as his wife was limited to social functions and domestic management that supported his business activities and public image. Catherine's educational background included undergraduate studies at Harvard University, where she had graduated summa cum laude with a degree in economics, while conducting research that contributed to her acceptance at Stanford Graduate School of Business for MBA studies focused on corporate finance and strategic management. Her academic excellence had earned recognition from professors and peers who considered her among the most talented business students they had encountered. Following her MBA completion, Catherine had been accepted to Yale Law School, where she had earned her law degree with specialization in corporate law, securities regulation, and white-collar criminal defense that provided comprehensive understanding of business operations, regulatory compliance, and legal consequences for executive misconduct and fiduciary violations. But Catherine's decision to suspend her legal career after law school to support Richard's entrepreneurial ambitions had created the false impression that she lacked professional ambition or business acumen, allowing Richard to dominate their relationship while underestimating her intelligence and strategic thinking capabilities that would ultimately prove devastating to his arrogance and infidelity. What Richard had never realized was that Catherine had maintained ownership of significant Sterling Dynamics equity through a complex trust structure established before their marriage, giving her legal control over corporate decisions and executive compensation that Richard believed he managed independently. Her legal expertise had enabled her to structure their prenuptial agreement and corporate governance documents in ways that protected her interests while providing mechanisms for holding Richard accountable for breach of fiduciary duty and personal misconduct. Catherine's discovery of Richard's affair with Madison had triggered a comprehensive investigation that included hiring private investigators, forensic accountants, and cybersecurity experts who could document the full scope of Richard's inappropriate behavior while ensuring that evidence collection met legal standards for potential criminal prosecution and civil litigation. The investigation had revealed that Richard's affair with Madison was part of a broader pattern of sexual harassment and workplace misconduct that affected multiple female employees throughout Sterling Dynamics' corporate hierarchy. His abuse of executive authority to coerce sexual relationships had created hostile working environments and legal liability that violated employment protection laws and corporate governance standards that shareholders expected management to maintain. Catherine's legal analysis had identified multiple grounds for removing Richard from executive positions while pursuing criminal charges for sexual harassment, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of securities regulations that governed executive conduct, and corporate disclosure obligations to shareholders and regulatory agencies. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Catherine had positioned herself in the parking garage with high-tech surveillance equipment that allowed her to monitor Richard's executive suite through the building's security system that she had legal authority to access as a major shareholder and corporate board member whose position Richard had failed to acknowledge or respect. Her surveillance equipment included military-grade cameras with telephoto lenses, directional microphones that could capture conversations through soundproof glass, and encrypted communication devices that preserved evidence while protecting her investigation from potential interference or corporate retaliation by Richard or his allies within the company. Catherine watched through her phone screen as Richard and Madison entered his private office for what they believed was a secret rendezvous, unaware that their affair was being documented by multiple recording devices that would soon provide evidence for the most comprehensive corporate scandal and executive downfall in Sterling Dynamics' corporate history. The timing of Catherine's surveillance was carefully coordinated, with legal proceedings, media exposure, and regulatory investigations that would maximize consequences for Richard's behavior while protecting employees and shareholders from the financial and reputational damage associated with executive misconduct and corporate governance failures. As Richard and Madison began their intimate encounter in the luxury executive suite that had been purchased with shareholder money and corporate resources, Catherine documented their inappropriate behavior while preparing to execute a plan that would destroy Richard's career, expose his crimes, and transform Sterling Dynamics into an ethical organization that prioritized employee welfare and shareholder value over executive privilege and personal gratification. The security cameras that Richard had installed to protect his corporate empire were about to become instruments of his destruction, providing high-definition evidence of behavior that would result in criminal prosecution, civil liability, and complete elimination of his wealth, power, and public reputation. Inside Richard's luxurious executive suite, the elaborate deception continued as he and Madison engaged in their affair, while believing they were safely hidden from observation and accountability. The opulent surroundings that Richard had created with corporate funds provided the perfect backdrop for behavior that violated every standard of professional ethics and fiduciary responsibility that shareholders and employees deserved from executive leadership. Catherine is completely oblivious to what goes on in the real business world, Richard told Madison, while pouring expensive champagne that had been purchased with company money. She thinks corporate leadership involves sitting in conference rooms discussing quarterly reports and strategic planning. She has no idea about the personal relationships and private arrangements that actually drive successful business operations. His comments revealed the depth of his contempt for his wife, while demonstrating his belief that infidelity was an acceptable part of executive privilege that came with corporate power and financial success. Richard's arrogance had blinded him to Catherine's actual intelligence and legal expertise, while creating vulnerabilities that she was systematically exploiting through comprehensive investigation and evidence gathering. Madison laughed at Richard's description of his wife, while adjusting her clothing in ways that she knew would appeal to his vanity and sexual desires. Poor Catherine. She's probably at home right now, organizing charity committees and planning dinner parties, while her husband is conducting real business with people who understand how corporate success actually works. The conversation revealed both participants' fundamental misunderstanding of Catherine's capabilities, while providing additional evidence of their contempt for marriage vows and professional boundaries that would strengthen legal cases for criminal prosecution and civil liability when their behavior was exposed to authorities and shareholders. Richard's behavior during the affair demonstrated the same narcissistic entitlement that characterized his treatment of employees and business partners throughout his career, using power and wealth to manipulate people into providing services and gratification that satisfied his ego and sexual appetites without consideration for consequences or ethical obligations. "Madison, you understand what successful men need in ways that wives never can," Richard said, while initiating physical contact that violated workplace harassment laws and created documented evidence of sexual misconduct between supervisor and subordinate employee. Wives are focused on social status and domestic security. They don't understand the stress and complexity of managing global business operations that require personal attention and strategic partnerships. His rationalization of infidelity as business necessity revealed psychological mechanisms that enabled systematic workplace harassment while creating legal liability for both individual misconduct and corporate culture violations that affected all Sterling Dynamics employees who deserved protection from executive abuse. Madison responded to Richard's advances with practiced enthusiasm that reflected her understanding of the transactional nature of their relationship and her belief that sexual compliance would advance her career goals within the Sterling Dynamics corporate hierarchy. Her participation in the affair represented both victimization by workplace power dynamics and personal responsibility for enabling Richard's inappropriate behavior. "Richard, you deserve someone who appreciates your intelligence and business acumen," Madison replied, while engaging in behavior that the security cameras captured in comprehensive detail for Catherine's documentation and legal proceedings. "Catherine doesn't understand the pressures you face or the personal support that visionary leaders require from people who share their ambitions and values." The exchange provided additional evidence of conspiracy to violate marriage contracts and corporate governance standards, while demonstrating the psychological manipulation that Richard used to justify his behavior and maintain Madison's compliance with inappropriate demands. As their affair continued in the executive suite, Richard became increasingly bold in his criticism of Catherine and his expressions of entitlement to extramarital relationships that he believed were justified by his business success and corporate position. His comments were preserved by multiple recording devices that Catherine had legal authority to access as a corporate shareholder and board member. "Catherine's problem is that she's never understood business or had to make the kind of difficult decisions that create wealth and corporate value," Richard explained, while the security cameras documented his inappropriate behavior. "She's lived her entire adult life supported by my success without contributing anything meaningful to our business operations or understanding the sacrifices that executive leadership requires." The statement revealed Richard's complete ignorance about Catherine's educational credentials, legal expertise, and corporate ownership positions that would soon be used to destroy his career, while demonstrating the misogynistic attitudes that characterized his treatment of women throughout his personal and professional relationships. Unknown to Richard and Madison, Catherine was documenting every word and action through multiple surveillance systems while coordinating with legal counsel, regulatory agencies, and media outlets that would ensure maximum exposure and consequences for their behavior when the evidence was revealed to the public and authorities. Catherine's surveillance equipment captured not only the physical aspects of their affair, but also the business discussions that revealed Richard's misuse of corporate resources, violation of fiduciary duties, and potential criminal activity that extended beyond workplace harassment to include securities fraud and embezzlement of shareholder assets. "I've been using the corporate jet for our weekend trips because it's technically business travel when I'm accompanied by my executive secretary," Richard explained to Madison while describing how he had been stealing company resources to fund their affair. The accounting department lists it as executive transportation for strategic planning sessions, so Catherine never sees the real expenses or destinations. The admission provided evidence of corporate fraud and misappropriation of shareholder assets that would support criminal charges beyond workplace harassment while demonstrating the systematic nature of Richard's misconduct and violation of fiduciary obligations to investors and employees. Madison's response revealed her awareness of the financial fraud while making her complicit in corporate crimes that would result in personal liability and professional consequences beyond her participation in workplace harassment and adultery. "That's brilliant strategic thinking," Madison said while acknowledging her participation in corporate fraud. "Catherine would never understand the business justification for executive travel and strategic planning that requires privacy and discretion from people who understand corporate operations." The conversation provided comprehensive evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud while documenting both participants' awareness that their behavior involved deception and theft of corporate resources that belonged to shareholders rather than personal use by executives and employees. As Richard and Madison continued their affair in the executive suite, their conversation revealed additional instances of corporate misconduct and personal betrayal that strengthened Catherine's legal cases while providing evidence for regulatory investigations and criminal prosecution that would destroy both their careers and personal reputations. "I've been gradually transferring some of our technology patents to overseas subsidiaries that I control personally," Richard admitted, while describing additional corporate fraud that Madison encouraged through her responses and participation. "Catherine thinks all our intellectual property is held by Sterling Dynamics, but I've been moving our most valuable assets to jurisdictions where I have complete control and tax advantages." The confession of intellectual property theft and tax fraud provided evidence of serious federal crimes, while demonstrating Richard's betrayal of shareholders and employees whose work had created the valuable technology that he was stealing for personal enrichment and financial advantage. Catherine's recording devices captured these admissions, while her legal team prepared comprehensive cases that would result in criminal prosecution, civil liability, and complete forfeiture of Richard's assets through restitution requirements and punitive damages that would eliminate his wealth while compensating victims of his misconduct. As the affair reached its climax in the executive suite, Richard and Madison remained completely unaware that their behavior was being documented by the woman they had consistently underestimated and dismissed, whose intelligence and legal expertise would soon result in consequences that exceeded their worst nightmares about accountability and justice. The security cameras continued recording as Catherine prepared to execute the final phase of her plan, which would expose their affair while simultaneously destroying Richard's corporate empire and personal wealth through legal mechanisms that he had never understood, despite his arrogance about business acumen and strategic thinking. Catherine Sterling timed her entrance to the Sterling Dynamics executive suite with surgical precision, using her corporate access codes to bypass security systems while Richard and Madison were still engaged in their affair, creating maximum shock value and comprehensive evidence of their inappropriate behavior in the luxury office that had been purchased with shareholder money. The executive elevator rose silently to the 68th floor as Catherine reviewed the evidence she had already collected through months of investigation, including financial records that documented Richard's theft of corporate assets, communications that revealed his pattern of sexual harassment, and surveillance footage that captured multiple instances of workplace misconduct and violation of fiduciary duties to shareholders and employees. Catherine's legal training had prepared her for this confrontation through careful analysis of corporate law, criminal statutes, and civil liability that would ensure maximum consequences for Richard's behavior while protecting her own interests and those of Sterling Dynamics employees who had suffered under his toxic leadership and sexual predation. The elevator doors opened silently as Catherine entered the executive suite's reception area, where the sounds of Richard and Madison's affair could be heard through the partially open door to his private office. Her hidden recording devices captured the audio evidence while building-wide security cameras documented her approach and the timing of events that would be crucial for legal proceedings and media coverage. Catherine paused outside Richard's office door to ensure that her recording equipment was functioning properly, while savoring the moment when her carefully planned revenge would begin destroying the man who had betrayed their marriage, stolen corporate assets, and abused his authority over vulnerable employees who deserved protection from executive predation. With calm deliberation that reflected her legal training and strategic planning, Catherine pushed open the office door to reveal Richard and Madison in compromising positions on the leather sofa that faced the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan's financial district. "Hello, Richard," Catherine said with icy calm that immediately froze both participants in their affair, while her recording devices captured their shocked expressions and panicked attempts to restore their clothing and composure. "I hope I'm not interrupting important business discussions." The sarcasm in Catherine's voice carried years of accumulated anger and betrayal, while her controlled demeanor demonstrated the strategic planning that had preceded this confrontation. Her legal expertise had taught her to maintain emotional control, while gathering evidence and making statements that would strengthen her position in subsequent legal proceedings. Richard's face went pale as he realized that his affair had been discovered by the one person whose anger and retaliation he had most reason to fear, though his arrogance prevented him from understanding the full scope of Catherine's knowledge about his misconduct and the legal mechanisms she had prepared for his destruction. "Catherine, this isn't what it looks like," Richard stammered, while attempting to regain his composure and control over a situation that had suddenly shifted beyond his ability to manipulate or manage. "Madison and I were having a private business discussion about confidential corporate matters that require discretion and privacy." His attempted explanation revealed the same pattern of deception and manipulation that had characterized his treatment of Catherine throughout their marriage, while providing additional evidence of his dishonesty and contempt for her intelligence that would strengthen her legal cases. Madison attempted to flee the scene by gathering her clothing and moving toward the door, but Catherine blocked her exit, while maintaining the calm demeanor that reflected her preparation for this confrontation and her understanding of the legal implications of everything that was occurring in the executive suite. "Madison, please don't leave yet," Catherine said with false politeness that carried obvious threat. "I think we should all have a conversation about workplace policies, professional ethics, and the legal consequences of inappropriate relationships between supervisors and subordinate employees." The reference to legal consequences immediately increased the panic that both Richard and Madison were experiencing, while demonstrating Catherine's knowledge of employment law and corporate governance standards that they had violated through their affair and misuse of corporate resources. Richard attempted to reassert control over the situation by relying on his traditional authority and intimidation tactics that had worked with employees and business partners throughout his career, not understanding that Catherine possessed legal knowledge and corporate power that exceeded his own capabilities. "Catherine, you're clearly upset about something you don't understand," Richard said while moving toward his desk, where he kept personal items and communication devices that could be used to summon security assistance. "Madison is my executive secretary, and our working relationship involves confidential discussions that require privacy and discretion." His continued lies and manipulation attempts were captured by multiple recording devices, while demonstrating the narcissistic personality traits that had enabled his systematic misconduct throughout his corporate career and personal relationships. Catherine's response revealed the depth of her knowledge about Richard's behavior and the comprehensive evidence she had gathered during months of investigation that included financial fraud, workplace harassment, and violation of corporate governance standards. "Richard, I know about all of it," Catherine announced while producing a tablet computer that displayed financial records, surveillance footage, and communications that documented the full scope of his misconduct. The corporate jet flights with Madison, the stolen intellectual property, the harassment of female employees, the misappropriation of shareholder assets, and the systematic violation of every ethical and legal standard that governs corporate leadership. The revelation of comprehensive evidence created immediate terror in both Richard and Madison as they realized that their behavior had been systematically documented, while Catherine had been preparing legal and financial consequences that would destroy their careers and personal lives. Richard's attempts to minimize the evidence and maintain some semblance of control demonstrated his fundamental inability to understand the severity of his situation and the sophisticated planning that Catherine had employed to ensure his complete destruction. "Catherine, you're overreacting to normal business operations that you don't understand because you've never been involved in corporate management," Richard replied, while revealing his continued underestimation of his wife's intelligence and legal expertise. "If you have questions about business practices, we can discuss them privately without involving Madison in personal disputes." His dismissive attitude and attempts to exclude Madison from accountability revealed his willingness to sacrifice his affair partner to protect himself, while demonstrating the selfishness and cowardice that characterized his approach to all personal and professional relationships. Catherine's next revelation destroyed any remaining hope that Richard might escape consequences for his behavior, while exposing the false assumptions that had enabled his arrogance and misconduct throughout their marriage and his corporate career. "Richard, what you don't understand is that I own controlling interest in Sterling Dynamics through trust structures that you never bothered to investigate," Catherine announced, while producing legal documents that proved her corporate ownership and authority. "I am the majority shareholder and chairman of the board of directors, which means I have legal authority to remove you from all corporate positions and pursue criminal charges for your theft and misconduct." The revelation of Catherine's corporate control created immediate shock and panic, as Richard realized that his wife possessed legal power to destroy his career, while his arrogance and sexism had prevented him from understanding the true structure of corporate ownership and governance. Madison attempted to distance herself from Richard by claiming that she had been victimized by workplace harassment and coerced into inappropriate behavior, not understanding that her recorded statements had already established her awareness and willing participation in corporate fraud and theft of shareholder assets. "Mrs. Sterling, I want you to know that Richard pressured me into this relationship by threatening my job and promising career advancement that never materialized," Madison said, while attempting to portray herself as a victim rather than willing participant in corporate misconduct. Her attempt at victimization was undermined by the recorded evidence of her enthusiastic participation in corporate fraud and her awareness that their behavior involved theft of company resources and violation of professional ethics standards. Catherine's response demonstrated her legal understanding of the complex issues surrounding workplace harassment, while making clear that Madison's participation in corporate fraud would result in personal consequences regardless of any coercion she might have experienced. "Madison, the evidence shows that you knowingly participated in corporate fraud and theft of shareholder assets," Catherine replied, while displaying financial records that documented Madison's benefit from stolen corporate resources. "Your participation in Richard's schemes makes you criminally liable regardless of any harassment you experienced." The legal analysis established that both Richard and Madison would face criminal prosecution, while eliminating any hope that either could escape accountability through claims of victimization or ignorance about their illegal behavior. As the confrontation continued in Richard's executive suite, Catherine systematically revealed the evidence and legal mechanisms that would destroy both participants in the affair while protecting Sterling Dynamics employees and shareholders from further misconduct and financial theft by corrupt executives. Catherine's methodical presentation of evidence transformed the executive suite into a courtroom where Richard and Madison faced comprehensive documentation of their crimes, while realizing that their affair had been merely the tip of an iceberg of misconduct that would result in criminal prosecution and complete financial ruin. "Let me show you exactly what I've discovered during my investigation," Catherine said, while connecting her tablet to the executive suite's large screen display that Richard used for corporate presentations. These financial records show systematic theft of corporate assets, including the private jet expenses you mentioned earlier. The screen filled with detailed accounting records that traced Richard's misuse of corporate resources for personal travel, luxury accommodations, and entertainment expenses that had benefited his affair with Madison, while defrauding Sterling Dynamics shareholders of millions of dollars in stolen assets and fraudulent expense claims. Richard watched in horror as Catherine displayed evidence of his financial crimes, while understanding for the first time that his wife possessed forensic accounting expertise and legal knowledge that had enabled comprehensive investigation of his misconduct and corporate theft. "These communications show your systematic pattern of sexual harassment involving multiple female employees," Catherine continued, while displaying email records and text messages that documented Richard's inappropriate behavior with subordinate workers throughout Sterling Dynamics' corporate hierarchy. The messages revealed explicit sexual propositions, threats of retaliation against employees who rejected his advances, and promises of career advancement in exchange for sexual favors that established clear patterns of workplace harassment and abuse of executive authority. Madison realized that her affair with Richard was part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior that made her another victim in a systematic scheme of workplace exploitation, though her participation in corporate fraud would still result in criminal liability, regardless of any harassment she had experienced. Richard, these surveillance recordings show your theft of proprietary technology and intellectual property that belongs to Sterling Dynamics shareholders, Catherine continued, while displaying footage from Richard's private meetings where he had discussed transferring valuable corporate assets to overseas entities that he controlled personally. The recordings captured Richard's admissions of intellectual property theft while establishing criminal intent and systematic planning that would support federal charges for corporate espionage and violation of fiduciary duties to shareholders and employees whose work had created the stolen technology. Richard's attempts to deny the evidence were undermined by the comprehensive documentation and his own recorded statements that established both criminal intent and systematic planning that eliminated any possibility of claiming innocent mistakes or misunderstanding of corporate governance requirements. Catherine, those recordings were obtained illegally without my consent, Richard protested, while attempting to challenge the admissibility of evidence that clearly established his guilt. You had no right to surveillance my private business discussions or record confidential communications. His legal objection revealed his ignorance about Catherine's corporate authority and shareholder rights that provided legal justification for investigating executive misconduct and protecting corporate assets from theft and misappropriation by corrupt management. Catherine's response demonstrated her legal expertise while establishing the legitimate authority that had enabled her investigation and evidence gathering throughout Richard's pattern of misconduct and corporate theft. Richard, as majority shareholder and chairman of the board, I have legal authority to investigate executive misconduct and protect corporate assets from theft and fraud, Catherine explained, while displaying corporate governance documents that established her oversight responsibilities and legal obligations. These surveillance systems were installed to protect Sterling Dynamics from corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. The legal analysis established that Catherine's investigation was not only appropriate, but required by her fiduciary duties to shareholders and employees who deserved protection from executive misconduct and corporate fraud that violated securities laws and employment protection statutes. Madison's growing panic led her to attempt cooperation with Catherine by offering to provide additional evidence against Richard in exchange for leniency, not understanding that her recorded participation in corporate fraud had already established criminal liability that could not be eliminated through cooperation agreements. Mrs. Sterling, I have additional information about Richard's financial crimes and harassment of other employees, Madison offered, while attempting to negotiate reduced consequences for her own misconduct. I can provide documentation and testimony that would support prosecution for his illegal activities. Her offer of cooperation was rejected by Catherine, who had already gathered comprehensive evidence, while understanding that Madison's criminal liability required accountability regardless of any assistance she might provide in prosecuting Richard for his more extensive crimes. Madison, your participation in corporate fraud makes you equally liable for criminal prosecution, Catherine replied, while displaying evidence of Madison's knowing participation in theft of corporate assets and intellectual property. Cooperation won't eliminate your legal responsibility for the crimes you committed. As Catherine continued her presentation of evidence, both Richard and Madison realized that their affair had exposed them to comprehensive legal consequences that would destroy their careers while resulting in criminal prosecution and financial ruin that neither had anticipated when they began their inappropriate relationship. These regulatory filings show that Richard concealed material information from shareholders about executive compensation, corporate governance violations, and legal risks associated with his misconduct, Catherine continued, while displaying securities documents that established additional federal crimes. The SEC investigation will result in criminal charges for securities fraud and market manipulation. The revelation of Securities and Exchange Commission involvement demonstrated that Catherine's investigation had extended beyond corporate internal affairs to include federal regulatory agencies that would pursue criminal prosecution for violations of securities laws and investor protection statutes. Richard's realization that federal investigators were already pursuing criminal charges created complete panic, as he understood that his legal jeopardy extended far beyond divorce proceedings and corporate termination to include potential prison sentences and complete forfeiture of personal assets through criminal restitution requirements. "Catherine, we can work this out privately, without involving government agencies," Richard pleaded, while attempting to negotiate some form of settlement that would limit his legal exposure and personal consequences. "I'll resign from Sterling Dynamics and provide whatever financial compensation you consider appropriate for any mistakes I may have made." His attempt at negotiation revealed his continued failure to understand the severity of his crimes and Catherine's determination to ensure maximum legal consequences for his systematic misconduct and betrayal of trust that had affected shareholders, employees, and their marriage relationship. Catherine's response established that criminal prosecution and civil liability were already proceeding through legal mechanisms that eliminated any possibility of private settlement or negotiated resolution that would allow Richard to escape accountability for his crimes. "Richard, the evidence has already been provided to federal prosecutors, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement authorities who will pursue criminal charges regardless of any private agreements between us," Catherine announced, while displaying correspondence with government agencies that established ongoing investigations. "Your criminal liability cannot be eliminated through divorce settlements or corporate resignations." The revelation that federal authorities were already pursuing prosecution created complete despair in both Richard and Madison, as they realized that their legal jeopardy was beyond their ability to control or negotiate away through private agreements or cooperation with Catherine's demands. Catherine's strategic planning included comprehensive media exposure that would ensure public accountability for Richard's crimes while protecting Sterling Dynamics' reputation and demonstrating the company's commitment to ethical leadership and corporate governance under new management that prioritized shareholder value and employee welfare. "The media will receive all evidence of your misconduct within the next hour," Catherine announced, while showing Richard and Madison the press release that had been prepared by Sterling Dynamics' communications department. "Your affair, corporate fraud, and criminal activity will be documented in major business publications and broadcast media throughout the world." The threat of public exposure created additional panic, as both Richard and Madison realized that their professional reputations would be destroyed, while their personal relationships and social standing would be eliminated through comprehensive media coverage of their crimes and inappropriate behavior. Richard's attempts to prevent media exposure revealed his continued belief that wealth and corporate influence could control information and public perception, not understanding that Catherine had already coordinated with journalists and media outlets to ensure maximum coverage and accountability. "Catherine, you'll destroy Sterling Dynamics' reputation and shareholder value if you expose internal corporate problems to media scrutiny," Richard argued, while attempting to use business concerns to prevent public accountability for his personal misconduct. "The negative publicity will affect our stock price and competitive position in ways that hurt innocent employees and investors." His argument attempted to make Catherine responsible for the consequences of his own criminal behavior, while ignoring his responsibility for creating the scandal through systematic misconduct and violation of corporate governance standards that shareholders and employees deserved. Catherine's response demonstrated her sophisticated understanding of crisis management and public relations strategies that would protect Sterling Dynamics while ensuring accountability for executive misconduct that had created legal and reputational risks. "Richard, the media strategy will focus on Sterling Dynamics' commitment to ethical leadership and corporate governance reforms that protect shareholders and employees," Catherine explained, while displaying the comprehensive communications plan that had been developed by professional crisis management consultants. "Your removal from executive positions will be presented as evidence of our commitment to accountability and ethical standards." The communications strategy established that Sterling Dynamics would benefit from demonstrating swift action against executive misconduct, while Richard's personal destruction would serve as proof of corporate commitment to ethical leadership and legal compliance. Within hours of Catherine's confrontation, major business publications received comprehensive evidence of Richard's crimes, while broadcast media prepared exposé features that would document his affair, corporate fraud, and sexual harassment in detail that would destroy his reputation permanently. The Wall Street Journal's investigation revealed the systematic nature of Richard's corporate theft and intellectual property fraud, while documenting his pattern of sexual harassment that had affected multiple female employees throughout Sterling Dynamics' organizational hierarchy. Business media coverage focused on Sterling Dynamics' governance reforms and Catherine's leadership transition, while portraying Richard's removal as evidence of corporate commitment to ethical standards and shareholder protection that would strengthen investor confidence in the company's future performance. Sterling Dynamics CEO removed following discovery of systematic corporate fraud and sexual harassment became headline news across major financial publications, while broadcast media prepared investigative reports that would detail Richard's crimes and their impact on corporate culture and employee welfare. The media coverage emphasized Catherine's educational credentials and legal expertise, while establishing her legitimacy as Sterling Dynamics' new leadership that would prioritize ethical business practices and corporate governance standards that protected all stakeholders. Technology industry publications documented Richard's theft of intellectual property while analyzing the competitive implications of his corporate fraud for Sterling Dynamics' market position and technological innovation capabilities under new management. Forbes magazine prepared a comprehensive profile of Catherine's background and qualifications while documenting her strategic planning and legal expertise that had exposed Richard's crimes while positioning Sterling Dynamics for continued growth under ethical leadership. The Harvard Business Review commissioned academic analysis of the Sterling Dynamics scandal while using the case as an example of corporate governance failures and the importance of board oversight in preventing executive misconduct and protecting shareholder value. International media coverage focused on the global implications of Richard's corporate fraud, while documenting the overseas intellectual property theft that had affected Sterling Dynamics' competitive position in international markets and technology development. Social media platforms erupted with discussion of the scandal, while female employees throughout the technology industry shared their own experiences with workplace harassment and sexual misconduct by male executives who abused their authority over vulnerable workers. The Sterling Dynamics hashtag began trending internationally as the story became a symbol of corporate accountability and the importance of protecting employees from executive predation and workplace harassment that violated professional ethics and legal standards. LinkedIn discussions focused on corporate governance lessons and the importance of diverse leadership that could prevent the kind of systematic misconduct that Richard had perpetrated while building support for Catherine's leadership transition and reform agenda. Twitter commentary included praise for Catherine's strategic planning and legal expertise, while condemning Richard's betrayal of trust and violation of professional ethics that had harmed employees and shareholders through his criminal behavior and corporate fraud. The viral nature of the story created additional pressure for comprehensive law enforcement investigation and prosecution, while ensuring that Richard's crimes would not be minimized or forgotten despite any attempts at damage control or public relations management by his legal team. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly to file criminal charges against Richard Sterling based on the comprehensive evidence that Catherine had provided, resulting in indictments for securities fraud, theft of corporate assets, violation of fiduciary duties, and sexual harassment that carried potential prison sentences exceeding 20 years. The Southern District of New York's White-Collar Crime Unit recognized that Richard's case represented an opportunity to establish important precedents for holding corporate executives accountable for systematic misconduct, while demonstrating that wealth and social status would not protect criminals from federal prosecution. The evidence in this case shows systematic criminal behavior that violated the trust of shareholders, employees, and the investing public, announced federal prosecutor Maria Rodriguez during the press conference that outlined criminal charges against Richard. The defendant used his corporate position to steal shareholder assets while creating a hostile working environment that victimized multiple female employees. The criminal indictment included detailed evidence of Richard's intellectual property theft, misappropriation of corporate resources, securities fraud, and sexual harassment that established clear patterns of criminal behavior rather than isolated incidents that could be explained away through legal technicalities. Madison Blake faced separate federal charges for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud and theft of shareholder assets, with prosecutors rejecting her attempts to claim victimization while establishing her knowing participation in criminal activity that benefited her personally and professionally. Richard's legal defense team, led by prominent white-collar attorney Jonathan Pierce, attempted to argue that his behavior constituted aggressive business practices rather than criminal misconduct, but the comprehensive evidence made such defenses impossible to sustain. The government has criminalized normal corporate governance and executive decision-making in ways that will stifle business innovation and entrepreneurship, Pierce argued during preliminary hearings while attempting to reframe Richard's crimes as legitimate business activities. But federal prosecutors countered with evidence showing systematic theft and fraud that exceeded any reasonable definition of legitimate business practices, while documenting Richard's intent to deceive shareholders and regulators about his criminal behavior. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed civil charges seeking complete disgorgement of Richard's assets and permanent prohibition from serving in executive positions at publicly traded companies, recognizing that his crimes had violated investor trust and market integrity. Employment law violations resulted in additional civil liability as multiple female employees filed harassment lawsuits that sought punitive damages for the hostile working environment that Richard had created through his systematic abuse of executive authority and sexual predation. The Department of Labor investigation revealed systematic violations of employment protection laws while documenting Richard's retaliation against employees who had resisted his sexual advances or reported inappropriate behavior to human resources departments. Internal Revenue Service audits identified tax fraud associated with Richard's theft of corporate assets and personal use of company resources that had been falsely claimed as business expenses to reduce his personal tax liability. State prosecutors in New York filed additional criminal charges for theft and fraud under state statutes while seeking restitution for Sterling Dynamics and its shareholders who had been defrauded through Richard's systematic misconduct. The complexity of criminal and civil proceedings created comprehensive legal accountability that eliminated any possibility of Richard escaping consequences through plea bargaining or settlement agreements that would minimize his punishment and financial liability. Catherine's legal expertise enabled her to coordinate with prosecutors and regulatory agencies, while ensuring that evidence collection and witness testimony would support maximum criminal penalties and civil damages that reflected the severity of Richard's crimes. The forfeiture proceedings targeted all of Richard's personal assets, including real estate, investment accounts, luxury vehicles, artwork, and personal property that had been purchased with stolen corporate resources or derived from criminal activity. His Manhattan penthouse, Hampton's estate, yacht, private jet, and art collection faced seizure by federal authorities, while civil litigation threatened any remaining assets that escaped criminal forfeiture requirements. The breadth of legal consequences eliminated Richard's wealth and social status, while ensuring that his criminal behavior would result in complete financial ruin and social destruction that reflected the harm he had caused to employees and shareholders. Madison's legal representation attempted to negotiate cooperation agreements that would reduce her criminal liability in exchange for testimony against Richard, but prosecutors insisted on substantial prison time that reflected her willing participation in corporate fraud. The employee class action lawsuits against Sterling Dynamics sought damages for the hostile working environment, while Catherine's leadership implemented comprehensive reforms that prevented future misconduct and strengthened protections for all employees. Federal sentencing guidelines recommended prison terms that would ensure Richard faced substantial incarceration, while the civil liability would eliminate his remaining assets through restitution and punitive damages that compensated victims of his crimes. The comprehensive nature of legal accountability demonstrated that Catherine's strategic planning had ensured maximum consequences for Richard's betrayal while protecting Sterling Dynamics and its stakeholders from ongoing legal and financial risks associated with his criminal behavior. Under Catherine's leadership as chairman and CEO, Sterling Dynamics underwent comprehensive transformation that eliminated the toxic culture Richard had created while implementing ethical business practices and corporate governance standards that protected employees and maximized shareholder value through legitimate business operations and technological innovation. The board of directors voted unanimously to implement Catherine's reform agenda that included enhanced oversight of executive behavior, strengthened employment protection policies, and transparency requirements that prevented the kind of misconduct that had characterized Richard's leadership, while ensuring accountability at all organizational levels. Sterling Dynamics will become a model for ethical corporate leadership and employee protection, Catherine announced during her first address to shareholders and employees as CEO. We will demonstrate that business success and ethical standards are complementary rather than competing objectives that can be achieved simultaneously through principled leadership. The corporate culture transformation included mandatory ethics training for all employees, enhanced reporting mechanisms for workplace harassment, and accountability systems that held managers responsible for maintaining professional standards and protecting subordinate employees from abuse or misconduct. Employee satisfaction surveys revealed immediate improvements in workplace morale and productivity, as Catherine's leadership eliminated the fear and intimidation that had characterized employment under Richard's toxic management, while creating opportunities for professional development and advancement based on merit rather than personal relationships with executives. The technology innovation pipeline that Richard had damaged through intellectual property theft was restored through Catherine's legal expertise and strategic partnerships with research institutions that strengthened Sterling Dynamics' competitive position while protecting shareholder assets from future theft or misappropriation. Major corporate clients who had terminated relationships during the scandal returned to Sterling Dynamics under Catherine's leadership, recognizing that the ethical reforms and governance improvements had strengthened the company's reliability and trustworthiness as a business partner. Institutional investors increased their holdings in Sterling Dynamics as Catherine's leadership demonstrated superior financial performance and risk management that protected shareholder value while maintaining ethical standards and regulatory compliance that eliminated legal liability and reputational risks. The employee protection programs that Catherine implemented included comprehensive harassment prevention training, enhanced security measures for reporting misconduct, and support services for employees who had experienced workplace abuse under Richard's leadership. Sterling Dynamics' stock price reached historic highs under Catherine's leadership as investors recognized that ethical corporate governance and employee protection enhanced rather than hindered business performance and competitive advantage in technology markets. The company's reputation for ethical leadership attracted top talent from throughout the technology industry as skilled professionals sought employment with organizations that maintained high standards for workplace culture and professional development opportunities. Catherine's strategic vision for Sterling Dynamics emphasized sustainable growth through technological innovation and ethical business practices that created long-term value for all stakeholders while maintaining competitive advantage through excellence rather than exploitation. The intellectual property portfolio that Richard had attempted to steal was strengthened through Catherine's legal expertise and strategic partnerships that accelerated research and development while protecting Sterling Dynamics' competitive advantages in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity markets. International expansion opportunities improved under Catherine's leadership as overseas partners recognized Sterling Dynamics' enhanced credibility and reliability under ethical management that prioritized legal compliance and professional standards in all business relationships. The corporate governance reforms that Catherine implemented became industry standards that influenced regulatory policy and business school curricula while demonstrating that ethical leadership and financial performance were mutually reinforcing rather than competing business objectives. Employee retention and recruitment improved dramatically as Sterling Dynamics became recognized as an employer that protected worker rights while providing professional development opportunities and competitive compensation that reflected the company's commitment to stakeholder value creation. Richard Sterling's conviction on all federal charges resulted in a 15-year prison sentence that eliminated his freedom, while comprehensive asset forfeiture requirements ensured that his criminal behavior would result in complete financial ruin and social destruction that reflected the scope of his crimes against employees and shareholders. The federal prison where Richard served his sentence required participation in white-collar criminal rehabilitation programs that addressed the narcissistic personality disorders and entitlement attitudes that had enabled his systematic misconduct and criminal behavior throughout his corporate career. Madison Blake's conviction for conspiracy and fraud resulted in a 5-year prison sentence and complete elimination of her professional credentials and career prospects in any industry that required trustworthiness and ethical conduct from employees and managers. The civil litigation settlements required Richard to pay over $2 billion in restitution and damages to Sterling Dynamics and affected employees, ensuring that any remaining assets would be distributed to victims of his crimes rather than supporting his personal lifestyle or legal defense costs. The forfeiture of Richard's luxury assets provided additional compensation for Sterling Dynamics, while demonstrating the financial consequences of corporate fraud and theft that eliminated the wealth and social status he had built through criminal activity. Richard's social ostracism was complete, as former business associates and wealthy acquaintances distanced themselves from any connection to his criminal behavior while protecting their own reputations and business relationships from association with documented corporate fraud and sexual harassment. The psychological impact of Richard's fall from corporate leadership to federal prisoner created additional consequences as he faced the reality of his choices and their impact on the people he had harmed through systematic misconduct and criminal behavior. Catherine's divorce proceedings resulted in complete separation of assets and termination of all personal and financial relationships while protecting her from any ongoing liability associated with Richard's criminal behavior or civil judgments. The prenuptial agreement that Catherine had negotiated with her legal expertise protected her personal assets while ensuring that Richard's crimes would not affect her financial security or professional reputation as Sterling Dynamics' ethical leader. Madison's personal relationships and family connections were destroyed by her criminal conviction and association with corporate fraud, while her professional reputation eliminated any possibility of employment in positions requiring trust or financial responsibility. The employment discrimination lawsuit settlements provided substantial compensation to female employees who had experienced Richard's sexual harassment, while creating legal precedents that strengthened protections for workers throughout the corporate sector. Sterling Dynamics' transformation under Catherine's leadership created positive outcomes for employees and shareholders, while demonstrating that ethical business practices enhanced rather than hindered financial performance and competitive advantage in technology markets. The broader impact of Richard's prosecution and Catherine's leadership included regulatory reforms and corporate governance improvements that strengthened accountability for executive behavior while protecting employees and shareholders from similar misconduct in other companies. Academic institutions incorporated the Sterling Dynamics case into business and law school curricula as an example of corporate fraud consequences, while highlighting the importance of ethical leadership and comprehensive governance systems that prevented executive misconduct. The technology industry adopted enhanced standards for executive behavior and employee protection based on Catherine's reforms at Sterling Dynamics, while recognizing that ethical corporate culture contributed to innovation and competitive advantage rather than hindering business performance. Epilogue: The lasting transformation. 5 years after Catherine Sterling exposed her husband's affair and criminal behavior, the comprehensive transformation of Sterling Dynamics and the broader corporate accountability movement had created lasting changes in business ethics, employee protection, and executive oversight that influenced industries throughout the global economy. Catherine's leadership as CEO demonstrated that ethical business practices and financial performance were mutually reinforcing objectives that created sustainable competitive advantage while protecting all stakeholders, including employees, shareholders, customers, and communities that depended on corporate responsibility and legal compliance. The Sterling Dynamics model for corporate governance and employee protection became international standards that influenced regulatory policy, academic research, and business practices throughout the technology industry, while inspiring similar reforms in other sectors where executive misconduct had created legal and reputational risks. Richard's criminal conviction and imprisonment served as permanent reminders that wealth and corporate position would not protect individuals from accountability for systematic misconduct, while demonstrating that comprehensive investigation and strategic legal action could ensure justice for victims of executive abuse and corporate fraud. The employee protection programs and ethical leadership training that Catherine implemented at Sterling Dynamics were replicated throughout the technology industry as companies recognized that workplace culture and professional standards affected both employee welfare and business performance in ways that required executive attention and accountability. Academic research based on the Sterling Dynamics transformation influenced business school curricula and corporate governance training, while providing frameworks for understanding the relationship between ethical leadership and sustainable business success that benefited all stakeholders. The legal precedents established through Richard's prosecution strengthened employment protection laws and corporate accountability mechanisms, while demonstrating that criminal behavior by executives would result in comprehensive consequences, including imprisonment and complete financial ruin. Catherine's personal transformation from underestimated wife to corporate leader demonstrated the importance of education, strategic planning, and legal expertise in challenging powerful individuals and institutions while creating positive change that protected vulnerable employees and stakeholders. Most importantly, the story reinforced fundamental truths about integrity, accountability, and the consequences of betraying trust in personal and professional relationships, while showing that justice was possible when victims possessed the knowledge, resources, and determination necessary to expose misconduct and ensure appropriate consequences. The viral footage that captured Richard's affair had become a catalyst for broader examination of corporate culture and executive behavior, while inspiring employees and shareholders to demand higher standards for leadership accountability and professional ethics in all business relationships. Their story continued to influence business practices, legal standards, and academic research, while serving as proof that individual courage and strategic action could challenge systematic misconduct and create positive change that protected vulnerable workers and strengthened corporate accountability. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what part resonated most with you. Until next time.